Please forgive me if I stutter, hesitate, or mispronounce anything while reading this work. This is Chapter 4, Part 2 of Passerine. Trigger warnings are as follows. Violence and mentions of violence, assault, and death. The blue valley stretched before Tommy, disappearing into the hazy horizon. The two mountains that bordered the valley rose menacingly on the front of him. Twin endpoints on the imposing mountain range that served as the kingdom's natural borders. A river ran through the middle of the valley, lit liquid gold by the sun, slowly rising over the distant hills. All in all, Tommy thought as he breathed in the cold dawn air, this would not be the worst-looking place to die in. The valley was named after the blue irises that thinned in it, lining the cliff sides and blooming along the river banks, but they were not the flowers Tommy was in search for. He ventured down the hillside, keeping his eyes close to the ground. He rolled up his pant legs to keep them dry from the morning dew that clung to the underbrush, but it left everything below his knees vulnerable to the traps that had been set around the camp. One wrong move and he'd lose a foot for his troubles, but he was determined to make the trip worth it. It had been a week since they had arrived at the valley, and while that meant most of their preparations were finished, it also meant that the other shoe would drop at any day now. Tommy could feel it breathing down his neck. The only way to combat it was a restlessness distraction, keeping his hands busy, so he traveled down the hill, one careful step at a time, until a flash of yellow in his periphery caught his attention. "Found you," he said, making his way to the flowers clustered under a rock, almost distinguishable from their blue iris neighbors, if they weren't for the golden center that earned them their name. When Tommy strolled back to camp, he had a fistful of morning glories clutched in his hand and a grin on his face. Everybody was already awake, clustering around cook fires, going through morning exercises, or just miling about. Someone had brought their guitar, and its soft music echoed above the sounds of conversation and laughter, people raising their heads when Tommy passed, calling his name or waving him over to join them for breakfast. He cheerfully declined, but not before exchanging jokes and pleasantries with some of the more familiar folk. It was easy to miss the shadows this way. In the right light, he might miss the tousled hair of those that had not slept in days, or the bleak look on the captain's face quickly hidden by a strange smile, or the smell of sulfur that clung to their clothes like a nasty, unrelenting parasite. It's pretty tragic, isn't it? The question stopped Tommy dead in his tracks. He turned towards the person who had asked, and found himself in front of a girl seated by a grindstone, slowly sharpening a small blade. "Pardon?" The girl smiled, and she nodded towards the flowers in his hand. "Morning glories. They wilt the same day they bloom, lasting only until the sun sets," she pauses. "Maybe less, now that you've picked them." Tommy flushed with embarrassment, suddenly getting the urge to hide the bouquet behind his back, as if it might somehow erase what he did. I'm sorry, I didn't think about—" The girl simply laughed. "No, don't be. I would be the world's biggest hypocrite if I told you to off picking flowers." At Tommy's confused look, she explained, "I own a flower shop, back at the city." "Oh!" Tommy looked down at the flowers clutching in his hand, and his brows furrowing as he thought, "It is sad, I suppose, that they die so quickly, but aren't they beautiful while they last?" The grindstone slowly ground to a halt as the girl merely sat there, staring at Tommy with an inexplicable expression on her face. "Well," thought Tommy, "this is awkward." "You know, Your Highness," the girl said at length, "you remind me of someone. He's a soldier in this camp, and about your age as well. He's off summer training right now, but I have this feeling that if you'd only meet, you'd make good friends." Tommy opened his mouth to reply, but he found he could only nod in agreement. The girl gave him a small, sad smile, as if she could understand the silence even more than if he had spoken, and went back to her work. Tommy pried his feet from the ground and began walking towards the heart of the camp, but the girl's words followed close on his heels. That was the true tragedy, wasn't it? More than flowers that only bloomed for a day. The bitterest devastation was the what-ifs. Tommy didn't understand why, but he found himself lingering one scenario, a different life, where he had met this person that he reminded the girl of, where neither of them were young soldiers. "You'd make good friends," she said, but that wasn't right. Tommy felt inexplicably down to his bones that if he'd met the boy, they would be brothers. It was only until the royal tent was in view that Tommy realized he didn't even ask the girl for the boy's name. "If we move this battalion here, they could provide cover, but we should also run the risk of—" "Tommy!" Tommy looked up. He hadn't even realized he'd entered the tent. He found Wilbur standing at the large desk that took up most room, leaning over a map littered with small carved pieces that represented various troop positions. Besides him, his hair unbound, was Technoblade. Both were staring at Tommy with concern. "What?" he demanded. You're crying, Tommy," Wilbur said softly. Tommy touched his free hand to his cheek and was surprised to find it came away wet. He rubbed furiously at his eyes until they were clear of the tears. This was not the time. This was not the frickin' time. He strode deeper into the tent, ignoring the worried look Wilbur threw Techno and Techno's answering shrug. Tommy stopped at one corner of the map and pointed to a cluster of carved archers clustered on what would be the hill they were currently on. "We don't need that many," he said determinedly. "Just one. Just you, Wilbur." Wilbur seemed frustrated by the change of topic, but had no choice other than to follow his little brother's lead. "You're overstimulating my aim, Tommy." Tommy drifted away from the map, throwing himself on a spare chair in the corner. He gestured Techno over, and the general silently complied. "You always pull through when it matters," Tommy said as Techno took the seat on the ground in front of him, his back to Tommy. As Tommy gathered Technoblade's hair in his lap, he added, "Except the many, many times you lost a duel with Techno." Normally, this would warrant a chuckle or, at the very least, an indignant eye roll, but Wilbur simply leaned over the map again, his expression shuddered once more. Techno turned to Tommy and whispered, "We might not break this intense, beast-like focus." Tommy snorted. "The only beast-like thing about him is his tangled lion's mane he calls hair." Wilbur's head snapped up to glare at them both. "I heard that." "Of course you did," Techno said, turning back away. "Lions have an unparalleled sense of hearing." Tommy laughed quietly to himself as he began braiding Techno's hair, his fingers making knots with ease that came with years of practice. This had been their routine for the past week. Wilbur would pore over the battle plans with wild-eyed obsession that got more and more frenzied each day by the day. Techno would call out every flaw in Wilbur's proposed changes until they encountered one that seemed to be actually useful, and Tommy would braid. It kept his hands busy. If it weren't for the distraction of Techno's hair between his fingers, Tommy would most likely join the flower shop girl over on the grindstone, mindlessly polishing his spear until doomsday. Sometimes Tommy would wake in the middle of the night and find his brothers still awake, reviewing their plans and muttering to himself, or not to himself, the voices, the mysterious, omniscient, creepy as hell voices that had plagued his brother for years. Tommy began to weave the morning glories he'd found into Techno's hair to hide the fact that his hands were still shaking. 2 nights before had been the worst of it. Tommy had been awoken by the noise of glass shattering. Opening his eyes, he found Wilbur standing over his cot, a shard of broken glass clutching in his hand and raised over his head, ready to strike into Tommy's chest. Tommy had stopped breathing completely. "Will," he had said, his voice coming out meek and trembling. "We're meant to kill you," Wilbur had croaked, blood dripping down his arms from how tightly he was holding the broken glass. "We're going to kill you, Tommy. It's fate. It's meant to be." "Wilbur," Tommy had reached out to clutch his brother's shirt. "Will, please don't hurt me." Wilbur had blinked rapidly, his eyelashes glistening with uneasy tears. "You haven't called me that in such a long time," and the glass shard was dropped, but not into Tommy's flesh, into the ground beside his cot, driven into the soft dirt. Wilbur had kneeled beside him for the rest of that night, whispering apologies that chased Tommy into his uneasy sleep. By morning, Wilbur seemed to have completely forgotten the incident, or chosen to ignore it completely, and Tommy was already plucking flowers off the hillside with shaky fingers. Tommy looked up now to find a white cloth tied around Wilbur's left hand, where the glass had cut into his skin. It was the only evidence that night had not been a dream, and that Wilbur's voices were slowly taking over. It must be the stress, Tommy thought as he braided the last of the morning glories into Techno's hair. When the war was over, Wilbur would be back to normal again, and Tommy could go back to not being absolutely terrified of his older brother. "Done," Tommy said as he flicked Techno's finished braid over Techno's shoulder. Finally, Techno stood and plucked one of the morning glories off his hair and tucked it behind Tommy's ear before moving over to one of the chests tucked under his table. "Consider this a sign of my gratitude." He opened the chest and pulled out something dark and folded. When he unfurled it, Tommy shot to his feet, his eyes going wide at the blue and red coat Techno held up, its golden buttons gleaming, and the royal coat of arms etched over where Tommy's heart would be. "They finished it!" Tommy couldn't help the laugh that bubbled out of him. "They actually finished it!" "Gods, Tommy," Techno said with a small smile. "It's just a uniform." But it wasn't just that, and Techno knew it. He and Wilbur had received their own uniforms weeks before, the general and their king in their bold colors. In the chaos of preparation, no one had noticed the prince following in their wake in a simple white tunic until the very last minute. Now the tailors had done it. They had actually finished it. Tommy bounded up to Techno, grinning so hard he thought his cheeks might split from pure glee. Techno rolled his eyes but held out the coat for Tommy to slip into. It fit perfectly. Tommy spun in a small circle before giving Techno a mocking bow. "Sir General," Techno returned his gesture. "Your Highness." "You two," Wilbur said, and Tommy could hear the smile in his voice, however faint, "are so stupid." Tommy waltzed over to his brother, knocking the carved pieces that Wilbur was about to put down onto the map. Over the sound of Wilbur's protest, Tommy grabbed his hand and pulled him along, humming a vaguely familiar tune, spinning him in slow circles that could be called a dance under the loosest of definitions. Wilbur went slack as Tommy continued to hum the song, allowing Tommy to spin him more and more. "I can't believe you still remember that," Wilbur said softly, his expression unfathomable. "Remember what?" "That song." And then they heard it, the sound that turned Tommy's blood cold, the sound that made Tommy and Wilbur freeze in their tracks, the sound that made Techno reach instinctively towards both of them. The drums of war, echoing over camp, eclipsed the music of a guitar, the conversation of friends, the screeching of blades against a grindstone, the thud, thud, thud of a 17-year-old soldier practicing his archery against a dark oak tree, the thud, thud, thud of the army's collective heartbeat, the thud, thud, thud of thousands of feet marching closer and closer. The enemy had arrived at the Blue Valley. They emerged from the mist like specters, the hazy sunlight glinting off their polished blades. Up on the hill, Techno could see them moving through the valley in a steady stream, the soldiers indistinguishable in their tight uniforms. At the front, someone bore their flag. 2 swords crossed on a simple green background. The sight of it made Techno ball up his fists in sudden, unidentifiable anger. This was it. It seemed like the entirety of the Green Army was here, as expected. While the valley would serve as a checkpoint in the Royal Army's favor, it was also a direct path towards the heart of their kingdom. So now both sides were going to throw all their pieces onto the board. One decisive battle, a quick end. Only one army would emerge from the valley intact, and Techno was sure be darned that it wasn't Wilbur's. Techno turned to his king standing beside him. "Are you ready?" Wilbur's eyes looked up to the mountains. "Ready as I'll ever be." The camp behind them was empty. Everyone was in position, moving like clockwork under the orders that they'd been practicing for days. The only ones left behind were Wilbur, Tommy, and Techno, and the archers. Tommy bounded up to them at last, his chest heaving with effort. "They sent up the flare," he announced breathlessly. "It's time to go. It's go time." Wilbur turned towards the group of archers behind them. Between them was a raging campfire, sending flickering shadows over Wilbur's face as he took one arrow from the quiver that dripped and dipped its cloth-covered point in the flames. The dozen archers, the best of the best, hand-picked by Wilbur himself, copied him wordlessly. The cloth, smothering in a special incendiary fuel, would burn faithfully until it reached its mark. Wilbur turned back towards the valley, knocking the arrow into his bow. With a deep breath, he pulled the arrow back and aimed towards the sky. Behind him, the archers did the same. "Hold!" he ordered. The Green Army marched closer. "Hold!" Techno felt a hand close around his, nails digging into his palm, and looked down to find Tommy staring intently at the encroaching forces, his eyes unblinking. They were close enough now that Techno could see the glare at the dawning sun bouncing off their breastplates. Wordlessly, Techno squeezed Tommy's hand. Now, Tommy thought, it has to be now. At the same time, Wilbur called out, "Fire!" 12 burning arrows arched out over the valley like comets in red and gold. The Green Army paused, perhaps in confusion at the pathetic display of force. Just 13 arrows soaring across the air. It would not even hit their front lines. But that didn't matter. They were not intended target. Once upon a time, Wilbur's aim had been so poor, it would have taken nothing short of divine intervention to correct it. So Techno corrected it. Now Wilbur shot true. His arrow landed amongst the weeds, and then there was fire. It felt like the whole valley was set ablaze, the heat searing Techno's skin even where he stood. The burning arrows had ignited a line of fire that ran horizontally through the valley, cutting the Green Army off completely. Soldiers from the Royal Army had doused that area in the ever-burning fuel the moment they saw the enemy coming, and then promptly fell back into the mountains, taking shelter for the next phase. The fire would not hold them off forever. Wilbur gave a signal, and the archers scattered to their next positions, leaving the three of them truly alone, watching the wall of fire for the first signs of life. It came in the form of a man in a white cloak, stepping through the flames like he was merely an inconvenience. He shrugged off the heat, flicking an ember off his shoulder before his eyes found them on the hill. He pointed his sword straight at Wilbur. "This isn't a white flag of surrender, Techno," Wilbur said quietly. "No, it's not," Techno replied, finally letting go of Tommy's hand and reaching for his trident. "It's a long shot, anyway. A little heat is nothing to mass murderers. You should know," his voice purred. "This is not the time for your sass," Techno thought back, as if that might stop the age-old melody that was starting to play in his head. The rest of the enemy army followed after the man in white, less gracefully but stubbornly, like God's darned cockroaches crawling over the valley. And then there was a battle cry ringing from all directions as the Royal Army appeared from their hiding spots, in the trees or in the weeds, from the river and from the mountains, and catching their enemy by surprise. But the Green Army was well trained. They recovered swiftly, and though most of their army was stuck behind the fire, they were biting back. It wasn't long until bodies were dropping, and not just the enemies. Techno's hands tightened around his trident, and the valley was filled with sounds of war, but it was not out of fear. Techno would never admit it, but out loud, but he could feel something almost like excitement pounding through his veins. This was familiar. This was something he knew. Deep in his bones, he could do without failure. Being Wilbur's teacher, and then Tommy's, that had been terrifying, but this was nothing. This was just another battle to fight, just another war to win. "We need to help," Tommy said, his feet already moving down the hill. Wilbur's hand shot out, dragging Tommy's backwards. Both Techno and Tommy looked at him in surprise, but Wilbur was looking past them, at the carnage happening right below their feet, his eyes dark as the earth, his freshly dug grave. "Wilbur?" Tommy asked in astonishment. Wilbur blinked rapidly. He was coming out of a dream. "Not yet," he said quietly. "What do you mean, not yet?" Tommy demanded, pulling himself out of Wilbur's grip. "Our people are dying over there." "Wilbur," Techno spun Wilbur by the shoulders towards him. "We have to go now." Wilbur took a rattling breath. "I know! Goodness darn it! I know!" He glanced at Tommy, standing beside them, and the face drawn in confusion. "But I can't let Tommy... Don't talk about me like I'm not frickin' here," Tommy spat angrily. "Wilbur, this is neither the time nor the place to underestimate we. We need to freaking go." "Tommy," Wilbur said, staring at Tommy in shock, "I never underestimated you." "Then prove it. Let's go." "You're right." The tired resignation colored Wilbur's words. "But stay close to me." He looked grimly back at Techno. "Don't lose yourself out there." Techno could hear the warning in his voice. "Take your own advice, Your Majesty," Techno replied shortly, taking in Wilbur's wide eyes and trembling hands. "I'm serious, Techno." Wilbur's expression hardened as he lowered his voice, speaking to Techno and Techno only, while Tommy was distracted by the fight below. "This is a direct order from your king. Keep them in check." "He thinks he can control you," the voices whispered. "He thinks he is your master. Will you prove him right, like the loyal little dog you are?" "I promise, Wilbur," Techno said. "After all, domesticated dogs," someone once said, "still frickin' bite." "All right," Wilbur said, shouldering the bow with a look of determination. "Let's go to war, boys."